The heat pressed down in a solid, shimmering sheet, baking the silence of 50 desperate men into the cracked earth of the yard. They stood in a ragged crescent, their faces maps of ruin, their eyes fixed on the 9 shaggy beasts in the corral. Not just any beasts. They were Alara's folly, her shame, the punchline to a joke that had lasted 16 months. Now, they were the only prayer the valley had left. Silas Blackwood, the cattle agent, stood beside her, his city boots filmed with the dust he so despised. He smelled of sweat and false cordiality. "You see, Miss Vance," he murmured, a proprietary hand gesturing toward the anxious crowd. "It's a seller's market. A woman alone, you can't manage this kind of demand. Let me handle the auction. A single block sale to the highest bidder. Clean, simple. You'll walk away a wealthy woman." Alara looked past him, her gaze settling on Mr. Gable, a man whose laughter had been the loudest when she'd first arrived. His prize Herefords were bones bleaching in his pasture now. His pride was gone, leaving only the raw, hollowed-out look of a man who had lost the arithmetic. Her eyes moved to the next man and the next. She knew their stories. She had heard them whispered in the general store, shouted in the saloon, muttered over fence posts. And she looked at her 9 ridgebacks, contentedly chewing tough weeds the other ranchers' cattle would have starved before touching. Stump, the old bull, watched the crowd with an air of profound indifference. Moss, his favorite cow, nudged a calf toward her flank. They were ridiculous, the town had said. Shaggy, stunted, more goat than cattle. They were worthless. She felt Blackwood's impatience, a vibration of greed in the hot air. He believed he had her. A young woman, alone, with the only living assets in a county of ghosts. Of course she would take the simple, profitable way out. He didn't know her. He had never once bothered to learn the first thing about her. She drew a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of dust and animal musk and desperation. "No, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the unnatural stillness. "I don't think I'll be doing that." 16 months earlier, the dust had tasted only of loneliness and the metallic tang of failure. Alara Vance arrived in the valley with a deed to 160 acres of land the locals called the Boneyard. It was her sole inheritance from a great-uncle she'd never met, a man considered even more eccentric in death than he had been in life. The land itself was a justification for the name. It was high, dry country, a platter of rock and thin, flinty soil that grew little more than greasewood and thistle. The creek that marked its western border was a seasonal memory, a dry scar lined with sun-bleached stones. Waiting for her, left behind like a final, inscrutable joke, were the animals. 9 of them. They weren't like any cattle she had ever seen. They were small and compact, covered in thick, shaggy coats of dun and brindle that seemed more suited to a mountain winter than this furnace of a summer. They had a distinct ridge of hair running down their spines and short, curved horns that gave them a faintly prehistoric look. They watched her approach with a calm, intelligent curiosity that was unsettling. When she stopped at the sagging rail fence, the bull, a grizzled old thing with a scarred nose, let out a soft huff that was less a challenge than a simple statement of fact. "Here we are." The town of Promise was no more welcoming than the land. When she went to the mercantile to file the deed and purchase supplies, the whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. "That's her," a woman in a calico dress murmured. "The one who got Old Man Vance's boneyard, Mr. Gable," a thick, prosperous man who owned the sprawling ranch to her south, was more direct. He looked her up and down, a young woman alone, her hands already showing the first signs of hard work, and chuckled. "Got the old man's scrub goats, too, I hear. You'd have done better to inherit a patch of poison ivy, miss. At least that'll grow." Silas Blackwood found her there, leaning against a barrel of nails as if he'd been waiting. He introduced himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Silas Blackwood, regional agent for the Western Cattle Consortium. I knew your uncle. A character. Listen, that land. It's no place for anyone, let alone. Well, and those animals are a genetic dead end. Can't sell the meat, hide's too rough. Tell you what, I'll give you $200 for the lot. The land and the nuisance stock. It's more than fair." It's Charity. She looked at his clean fingernails, his polished boots. He was a vulture dressed as a songbird. No, thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I think I'll see what it is I've got first. His smile thinned. A thing's only worth what others will pay, Miss Vance. And no one will pay for that. The mockery was a constant, low-grade fever. They watched her haul water by the bucket from the nearly dry well. They saw her mending fences that seemed to be holding in nothing of value. They called her the goat girl of the boneyard. She did not argue. She did not explain. She met their pity and their scorn with a quiet stillness that they mistook for foolishness. Being right is its own kind of reply, but she wasn't right yet. She was just working. She spent her days watching. Her education began not in a book, but in the patient observation of the 9 strange beasts who shared her dusty inheritance. She rose before the sun, when the air was cool and the light was the color of pearl, and she would sit on the porch, a mug of weak coffee in her hands, and simply watch. The ranchers in the valley raised Herefords and Shorthorns. Big, square animals bred to turn lush grass into beef. They were placid, predictable, and utterly dependent on the managed abundance of a prosperous ranch. Her ridgebacks were different. They did not graze in the lazy, methodical way of other cattle. They browsed. They moved through the scrub with a nimble, goat-like grace, their mouths seeking out the very things the other cattle ignored. They ate the leaves of the tough greasewood, nibbled on the purple heads of the thistles, and stripped bark from the stunted junipers. They were not grazers. They were foragers. They turned the boneyard's poverty into sustenance. Their water consumption was the second lesson. The big Herefords on Gable's ranch drank from a full creek and deep wells, consuming gallons a day. Her 9 animals would visit the trough she laboriously filled only once, in the cool of the evening. They drank slowly, deliberately, and then would wander off, seemingly untroubled by the heat. She began to keep a tally, the first entry in what she came to call the arithmetic of survival. She calculated the water hauled against the number of head, the forage available against their appetites. The numbers told a story that defied all the valley's wisdom. These animals belonged here. They were a living expression of this hard, unforgiving land. One evening, a visitor appeared at her gate. He was an old man, his back bent into a permanent question mark, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He introduced himself as Carl Sorensen. He'd come from Denmark 40 years ago and had a small, neat farmstead on the other side of the ridge, a place most people ignored. He carried a small basket of fresh eggs. "A welcome," he said, his voice a soft, rumbling accent. For the new neighbor, his eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear, went past her to the corral. They widened just for a second. He walked to the fence, his movements slow and reverent. The old bull, Stump, lifted his head and regarded him without alarm. "I have not seen this kind since I was a boy," Sorensen murmured, more to himself than to her. "My grandfather kept them. In the old country, they called them stone-eaters. He said they could get fat on a landscape of prayer and dry rock." He turned to her, a deep understanding in his gaze. He saw not a foolish girl with worthless stock, but a keeper of something old and forgotten. "The land remembers what the farmer forgets," he said, his voice gentle. "These cattle, they remember the hard times. The big, fat ones. They have forgotten. You listen to the old things, little miss. They know how to last." That night, Alara did not feel alone. She had the company of 9 shaggy beasts and 1 old man's words. She had a purpose. It was not just to survive, but to listen. By June, a routine had settled into the rhythm of her bones. The work was hard, a constant ache in her back and shoulders, but it was honest work. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and tough as old leather, a fact she noted with a certain grim pride. She had cleared the choked spring at the far end of her property, digging out years of accumulated silt and rock until a trickle of clear, cold water began to seep into a small basin she lined with clay. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She could lead the cattle there every other day, saving her the back-breaking labor of hauling from the well. The herd was her focus. She learned their individual personalities, the subtle hierarchy of the small group. Stump, the old bull, was the undisputed patriarch, a creature of immense calm and dignity. Moss was his placid queen. Then there were the younger cows, Pebble, Shale, and Juniper, each with her own quirks. The 4 yearlings were skittish and playful, shadows that darted at the edges of the herd. One afternoon, a boy appeared at the fence line. He couldn't have been more than 10, with a shock of straw-colored hair and clothes that were clean but patched. He said nothing, just stood and watched the Ridgebacks with wide, solemn eyes. He came back the next day and the day after that. On the 4th day, Alara brought him a glass of water. "You're Leo, aren't you?" she asked. From the Henderson place, he nodded, his eyes still fixed on the animals. "They're funny-looking," he said, not as an insult, but as a simple observation. "Mr. Gable says they're not worth the powder to blow them to perdition." "Mr. Gable has never been properly introduced," Alara said calmly. "That big one is Stump. The one next to him is Moss." Leo's face lit up. He had found a kindred spirit. From then on, he was her shadow. He helped her haul rocks for the spring basin. He learned to mend the fences, his small hands surprisingly deft. But his real gift was with the animals. He had a quiet, patient way about him that they seemed to sense. He was the one who finished naming the herd. The yearlings became Flicker, Dash, Twig, and Bramble. His presence was a balm against the loneliness she rarely admitted even to herself. He never asked for anything, but she made sure he had a full meal before he left each day, and sometimes a jar of the wild plum preserves she'd put up. Their friendship was built on the silent, shared work of the farm. Together, they watched the subtle changes. The Ridgeback's coats, which had been dull on her arrival, now had a healthy sheen. They were filling out, their compact bodies solid with muscle. They were not fat in the way of Gable's Herefords, but they were powerfully, efficiently healthy. And then, one morning in late summer, she saw it. Moss was standing apart from the others, licking clean a small, wet, dun-colored calf. A new life. A week later, Pebble had a calf of her own. The arithmetic changed. 9 had become 11. Her secret hope, the one she'd kept banked low like a coal under ash, now had a name. Increase. She and Leo stood watching the 2 new calves wobbling on unsteady legs, their mothers protectively nudging them. "They're so small," Leo whispered in awe. "They're survivors," Alara corrected gently. "They'll grow." The town of Promise marked time by the turning of seasons and the price of beef. By the following spring, Alara's herd had grown to 15. 2 of the yearlings had proven to be bulls, which she kept separate, and the older cows had all calved successfully. The boneyard, to any passing eye, looked as sparse and unforgiving as ever. But within its fences, a quiet miracle was unfolding. The Ridgebacks, through their browsing, were slowly changing the land. By clearing the toughest brush, they were allowing native grasses, long choked out, to begin to return in the low spots. It was a slow, subtle healing that only she and Leo could see. The mockery from the town had mostly subsided, replaced by a kind of indifferent pity. The goat girl was still there, still working her worthless patch, but she was no longer a novelty. She was just a fixture, a part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the rocks she farmed. She kept her success to herself. When she went to town for supplies, she bought flour, salt, and coffee, never feed. No one could understand how her herd was growing without her buying hay, and their inability to solve the puzzle simply reinforced their opinion that whatever she was doing was insignificant. Her first visitor from the outside world arrived in a cloud of dust and curses. A fancy-looking buggy with a snapped axle sat stranded on the road bordering her property. The driver, a portly man in a white apron and a sweat-stained city hat, was fuming. "A full day's ride from anywhere," he lamented. "The name's Antoine. I'm the head cook for the Grand Hotel in the capital. Was on my way to inspect a new beef supplier." Now this Alara offered him water, and then, seeing his predicament, a place to stay while someone rode to town for the blacksmith. He was skeptical, eyeing her small, rough cabin, but he had little choice. That evening, she shared her meal with him. It was simple fare: potatoes from her small garden, fresh-baked bread, and a thick steak she had seared in a cast-iron skillet. Antoine ate politely at first, then with a growing, focused intensity. He put down his fork, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My good woman," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. What is this meat?" "It's ridgeback," she said simply. "My cattle." He took another bite, chewing slowly, his eyes closed. "The flavor, it is complex. It is not just beef. Tastes of herbs, of the wild. It is lean but not tough. It is the most remarkable piece of meat I have tasted in 20 years." Before he left the next day, his buggy repaired, he made her an offer. He didn't care what the animals looked like. He cared what they tasted like. He offered her a price per pound that was nearly double what the best Hereford beef fetched from the consortium. He wanted everything she could spare. "You are not a rancher, madam," he declared, pressing a significant cash advance into her hand. "You are an artist, and these animals are your masterpiece." She stood watching his buggy disappear, the weight of the bills in her pocket a solid, undeniable fact. It had worked. The scorn of the valley, the wisdom of the cattleman, the condescension of Silas Blackwood. It was all meaningless noise. Her patience, her observation, her stubborn belief in the forgotten things had been validated not by her neighbors, but by a stranger who understood the simple truth of quality. She looked at her herd, grazing peacefully on the hillside. They were not just survivors anymore. They were a fortune. The first sign of the coming trouble was the sky. Day after day, it was a vast, empty bowl of brilliant, merciless blue. No clouds gathered over the distant mountains. The sunsets were brassy and hot, leaving no dew on the ground. Old Mr. Sorensen, leaning on her fence one afternoon, squinted at the horizon. "The air is too still," he said, his voice heavy. "The crickets are quiet. The land is holding its breath." Ilara felt it too. The water level in her spring basin had dropped by 2 inches. The grasses that had started to return were turning a pale, brittle yellow. Her ridgebacks seemed untroubled, still finding sustenance in the deep-rooted brush, but a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. By July, the valley was in the grip of a full-blown drought. The creek that watered Gable's ranch and a dozen others shrank to a muddy trickle and then vanished completely, leaving a cracked, serpentine scar. The lush pastures that had been the pride of the county burned to the color of old straw. The big Herefords, bred for a life of ease and abundance, began to suffer. They stood listlessly in the shadeless fields, their heavy bodies losing flesh, their ribs beginning to show. The price of hay, shipped in by rail from greener states, tripled, then quadrupled. Panic began to set in. The talk in town turned from cattle prices to survival. Men who had boasted of their herds now spoke in hushed, frightened tones. They were selling off their stock for pennies on the dollar to agents like Silas Blackwood, who circled the failing ranches like the buzzard he was. Gable was hit the hardest. His entire fortune was tied up in his prize-winning cattle and the land that was now failing them. He mortgaged his property to buy hay, then watched as his animals continued to weaken. The drought was a ruthless accountant, and it was calling in every debt of hubris and poor planning. Ilara's boneyard, once a symbol of poverty, now seemed like an oasis of grim competence. Her 15 head of ridgeback were lean but healthy. Their unique diet and low water needs meant they were weathering the drought with an ease that seemed to defy nature. She and Leo worked tirelessly, hauling extra water from the well now that the spring was too low, but their small, efficient operation was holding. One afternoon, Silas Blackwood's buggy pulled up to her gate again. He didn't look smug this time, he looked predatory. His eyes scanned her property, noting the healthy state of her animals. "Miss Vance," he said, forgoing any pleasantries, "the valley is collapsing.
I'm consolidating assets.
I'll give you $5,000. For the land, the cabin, and all 16 head of stock." He'd miscounted. She had 15. The slip was revealing. He had been watching her, counting her animals, assessing her worth. "That's a generous offer," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "Considering no one will pay for them." His smile was thin and sharp. "It's a different market now. Things that can survive are suddenly invaluable. A woman alone can't manage a crisis like this. You'll have thieves, squatters. Take the money and go back to wherever you came from. It's the smart play. I appreciate the advice, Mr. Blackwood, she said, meeting his gaze. But I'm not for sale. His face hardened. You're making a mistake. Pride is an expensive luxury in a drought. He turned and left, his departure leaving a trail of dust and silent menace. That night, for the first time, she cleaned and loaded her father's old shotgun and leaned it by the door. The arithmetic had changed again. It was no longer about increase, it was about holding on. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The heat was a physical presence, relentless and suffocating. The dust from the ruined pastures coated everything in a fine red powder. The town of Promise was a place of ghosts. Stores were shuttered. Families were packing up wagons, abandoning land that had been in their names for generations. The silence was broken only by the wind and the low, mournful sound of starving cattle. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of angry orange, a figure appeared walking up the long track to her cabin. It was Mr. Gable. He was a changed man. The blustering arrogance was gone, replaced by a stooped, hollowed-out weariness. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his face was etched with a despair so profound it was painful to look at. He stopped 10 feet from her porch, holding his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice raspy. He had to stop and clear his throat. My family, we haven't had meat in 3 weeks. The stores are empty. I heard, they're gone. All of them, died or sold for scrap." He finally looked up, and she saw the raw shame in his eyes. The man who had laughed at her, who had called her animals scrub goats, was now standing before her as a beggar. "I came to ask if I could buy one of your animals, just a young one. I can't pay what it's worth. I have almost nothing left. But I can give you my word I'll pay the rest when the rains come. If they ever come." This was the moment, the culmination of 16 months of scorn. She held all the power. She could have refused him. She could have named an impossible price, savoring the reversal of their fortunes. She could have reminded him of his mockery, of his cruelty. She saw the faces of his children in her mind, children who had done nothing to earn their father's pride or his downfall. She thought of Mr. Sorensen's words. They know how to last. Lasting wasn't about winning. It was about enduring. It was about what you did when you had the choice not to. "The price is what the cook from the Grand Hotel pays me," she said, her voice even. "It's a fair price. You can pay me half now, and the other half when you're back on your feet." No interest. Gable stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had come expecting rejection or humiliation. He was utterly unprepared for grace. Tears welled in his eyes, and he wiped them away with the back of a dusty hand. "Why?" he choked out. "After how I treated you?" "Because hunger changes a town," she said softly. "And my herd is no good to me if I'm the only one left in the valley." She and Leo separated a young bull from the herd. Gable paid her with the last of his money, his hand trembling as he counted out the worn bills. He led the animal away, his back a little straighter than it had been when he arrived. Word of what she had done spread faster than a prairie fire. It was not a story of business. It was a parable of decency in a world stripped bare. The next day, 2 more ranchers came to her door, then 3 more the day after that. They came not with offers, but with requests, their pride swallowed by the great, leveling force of desperation. She treated them all the same. Fair price, promise of payment, an affirmation that they were neighbors, not competitors. The gathering in her yard was not her idea. It was Silas Blackwood's. Having failed to buy her out, he had switched tactics. He presented himself to the desperate ranchers as their savior. He would organize a formal auction, ensure a fair process, and convince the stubborn Miss Vance to sell her entire herd for the good of the community. He intended to control the sale, buying the lot himself through a proxy bidder at a price depressed by the rancher's own poverty, then reselling the animals individually at a massive profit. He stood beside her now, his voice a smooth balm of reason for the crowd. "We all know Miss Vance has been generous," he announced, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "But charity won't rebuild our valley. We need a foundation. The Western Cattle Consortium, through me, is prepared to make a substantial offer for the entire herd. A single, clean transaction. We will then ensure these remarkable animals are distributed equitably to those ranchers most able to—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Maximize their potential." It was a speech about turning her hard-won survival into his commodity. The men shifted, their faces grim. They were desperate enough to consider it. All eyes turned to her. This small, quiet woman who had been the butt of their jokes was now the arbiter of their future. Leo stood near the corral, his hand resting on Stump's broad, shaggy neck. The boy's presence grounded her. She thought of the arithmetic, not of money but of community. What was the value of a neighbor? What was the price of a shared future? She stepped forward. The yard fell silent. "Mr. Blackwood is right about one thing," she began, her voice clear and steady. She had never spoken to a crowd before, but the words felt solid, earned. "We need a foundation, but a foundation isn't built by one man with a deep pocket. It's built by many hands, all working their own ground." She looked from face to face, meeting the eyes of the men who had scorned her, the men she had fed. "My herd is not for sale." "Not as a lot," a murmur went through the crowd. Blackwood's face tightened into a mask of fury. "But my cattle are for sale," she continued, her voice rising with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. "I will sell 8 breeding pairs. 1 bull, 1 cow. That is enough to start 16 new herds. To start this valley over. The price will be fair, what the market says they are worth, so I can secure my own future. But I will not sell to the highest bidder. I will sell to families. To the people who are staying. To my neighbors." She looked directly at Blackwood. "I will not sell a single animal to a man who thinks this valley is just an asset on a ledger." It was a declaration of war, and she had won it before he could speak. A cheer went up, a raw, ragged sound of pure relief. Mr. Gable was the first to step forward. "I'll take a pair, Miss Vance. And I'll pay my debt on the first one as soon as I can, one by one." They came forward, their names added to a list she kept in a small ledger. They were not buying cattle. They were buying hope. Blackwood stood alone, his scheme shattered, exposed by his own greed in front of the entire community. He turned without a word, climbed into his buggy, and was gone. The sales took 3 days. Alara, with Leo as her solemn assistant, guided the ranchers as they chose their pairs. There was no haggling, no argument. There was a quiet, respectful gravity to the proceedings. They were dividing up the future. She made sure each family got a strong, healthy pair, explaining the animals' habits, their needs, their surprising strengths. She was no longer just the keeper of the Ridgebacks. She was their historian, their advocate. She was teaching the farmers how to listen to the land again. When it was over, her own herd was reduced to 7 animals. Stump, Moss, and 5 of their offspring. Her corrals felt empty, but her small cabin felt like the center of the world. The money, a substantial sum, was locked safely in a box, but the real profit was in the sounds she could now hear from her porch. The distant lowing of a ridgeback on Gable's land, the shout of a neighbor she now knew by name, the slow return of life to a valley that had been on the verge of death. Mr. Sorensen came to visit the evening after the last pair had been led away. He sat with her on the porch steps, watching the 7 remaining Ridgebacks browse peacefully in the twilight. They didn't speak for a long time. "My grandfather," Sorensen said finally, his voice soft in the gathering dark. "He used to say that a man's worth is not what he builds for himself, but what he leaves for others to build with." He looked at her, his pale eyes full of a deep, quiet pride. "The land remembered," he said, his voice gentle. "And you listened. But you did more than listen. You taught the others how to hear it, too." The rains came in September. Not a deluge, but a slow, steady soaking that turned the red dust to dark, rich mud. Small shoots of green began to appear in the pastures. The valley, scarred and humbled, began the slow process of healing. Alara's boneyard was no longer a joke. It was a landmark. Her name was spoken with a respect that bordered on reverence. She was no longer the goat girl. She was Alara Vance, the woman who had remembered the old ways, the woman who had chosen community over profit. One afternoon, Leo came running to the cabin, his face alight with excitement. "Alara, come see." He led her to the pasture. There, standing beside Moss, was a new calf, the firstborn since the drought had broken. It was small and shaggy and perfect. She knelt, running a hand over its damp, dun-colored coat. She looked up at the vast, clear sky, at the greening hills that rolled away to the horizon, at the small, determined boy beside her, and at the 7 ridiculous, stubborn, beautiful animals that had saved them all. The arithmetic of survival was complex. It was not just about water and forage or profit and loss. It was about patience and observation, about kindness and courage. It was about understanding that the things the world deemed worthless often held the key to everything. She had started with 9. She had 7 now, and the whole valley was rich.